In the quiet town of Riverton, a single encounter changes everything. When 9-year-old Lily is wrongfully detained by Officer Riley outside a grocery store, her mother, Alicia, decides to fight back. What starts as a local incident quickly spirals into a legal battle that divides the community. As Alicia seeks justice for her daughter, secrets and biases are exposed, and Riley faces the fallout of a decision he can't take back. Can Alicia's fight for change bring the town together? Or will it tear Riverton apart for good? And is redemption possible for those who've made the deepest mistakes? Don't miss this powerful story. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. How can a community heal after trust is broken? We'd love to hear your perspective. The town of Riverton, nestled between rolling hills and the slow-moving river Coates, wasn't the sort of place that made headlines. It was a town where people still left their doors unlocked, where summer fairs drew crowds to the old town square, and where the biggest gossip was who might buy the old gas station that had been boarded up for years. Life moved slowly in Riverton, and its residents preferred it that way. But beneath the surface of this small-town charm ran a tension that had been building for years, a tension that most people preferred not to talk about. It was a town divided by unspoken rules and boundaries. The cozy houses with their manicured lawns sat to the north, while to the south, closer to the old industrial quarter, the neighborhoods were more tightly packed, the sidewalks cracked, the lawns untended. It was a divide drawn along economic lines, but those lines often matched the unspoken racial divisions too. Alicia Brooks lived on the south side, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment where she could just see the river from her window if she stood at the right angle. She had grown up in Riverton, in a house just a few streets away, and she loved the town even if she had come to see its flaws more clearly as she got older. Now a single mother at 35, Alicia had learned to be tough. She balanced 2 part-time jobs, waitressing at the Riverton Diner and cleaning offices downtown, to make ends meet. But she never let her struggles show in front of her daughter, Lily. For Lily, she wanted a world where everything felt safe, even when it wasn't. Lily was 9, a bundle of curiosity and energy. Her bright smile and infectious laugh brought light to even the darkest of days. She loved stories, especially the ones her mother told her at bedtime. Tales of brave girls who went on adventures and found treasure. Her favorite possession was her plush dog, Maxie, a gift from her father before he had left them years ago. Maxie was always by her side, a constant comfort in an ever-changing world. On the morning that would change everything, the sun rose over Riverton, bathing the town in soft golden light. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant hum of lawnmowers. Alicia and Lily walked hand in hand down Riverton's main street toward the grocery store, enjoying the quiet of a Saturday morning before the town woke up. "Mommy, can we get strawberries today?" Lily asked, glancing up at her mother with hopeful eyes. "You promised we could make strawberry shortcake." Alicia laughed softly, squeezing her daughter's hand. "We'll see, sweetie. If they're on sale, I'll grab a pack. But we have to stick to the budget, okay?" Lily nodded solemnly. She knew what that meant. Her mother had explained it to her enough times. It meant counting every dollar, making sure that they had enough left for rent, bills, and all the other things that came before treats like strawberry shortcake. Even at 9, Lily understood more about grown-up worries than her mother would have liked. They reached the Riverton Grocery Mart, a local staple with its red and white awning and the smell of fresh bread wafting through the open doors. Alicia turned to Lily, crouching down, so they were eye to eye. "Lily, I need you to stay right here, okay?" Alicia said, her voice gentle but firm. "I won't take long. Just wait on the bench, and keep Maxie with you." Lily nodded, clutching Maxie tightly to her chest. "I promise, Mommy." Alicia kissed Lily's forehead, then hurried inside, grabbing a basket and scanning the aisles for the items on her list. She wanted to get in and out quickly. Lily was usually patient, but Alicia knew that waiting could be boring for a child, and she didn't like leaving her daughter alone for too long, even in a town as seemingly safe as Riverton. Meanwhile, Lily settled onto the bench outside the store, her legs swinging beneath her. She hugged Maxie to her chest and watched the people passing by. She liked watching people, imagining little stories about them, who they were, where they were going, what they might be thinking. It made time pass quickly. Well, across the street, a man with a white beard walked his dog, a shaggy golden retriever that made Lily smile. A young couple strolled by, holding hands and laughing at some private joke. Lily wondered what it would be like to be older, to go on dates and laugh like that. Her mind wandered to her friends from school, the games they played at recess, and the stories they made up about their imaginary kingdoms. She glanced toward the store entrance, hoping to see her mother's familiar figure coming out. But Alicia was still inside, lost in the maze of aisles. Lily adjusted her grip on Maxie and began humming softly, a tune she had heard on the radio. She felt a sense of contentment, the kind that only a 9-year-old can feel when everything seems right in the world. But everything was about to change. Across town, Riley Adams sat in his patrol car, cruising slowly along the familiar streets of Riverton. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face weathered by years of working on the force. His hair was cut short, military style, and he had a habit of narrowing his eyes when he was concentrating, giving him a perpetual look of suspicion. Riley had joined the Riverton Police Department fresh out of high school, following in the footsteps of his father, a decorated officer who had once been the pride of the town. But times had changed since then, and so had the town. The respect that officers used to command in Riverton had been replaced with scrutiny, suspicion, and a sense of disconnect between the police and the community they served. Riley had tried to adapt to the changing atmosphere, but it wasn't easy. He prided himself on being vigilant, on spotting trouble before it could cause harm. His colleagues often joked that he had a sixth sense of sniffing out danger, and Riley wore that reputation as a badge of honor. But over time, that vigilance had hardened into something less admirable, a tendency to see threats where none existed, to judge too quickly and act even quicker. He'd been through a messy divorce 2 years ago, a painful process that left him more alone than he'd ever been. It was one of those things he tried not to think about, how he had once dreamed of being a father, of having a family, and how those dreams had dissolved into long, lonely nights in his apartment. His ex-wife had told him that he'd become too closed off, too unwilling to see the good in people. But Riley dismissed her words as part of their marital strife, just another wound he didn't need to reopen. That morning, as he drove through Riverton's north side, Riley kept his radio turned low, listening to the usual chatter about traffic stops and noise complaints. It was shaping up to be another quiet Saturday, just the way he liked it. He made his way south toward the grocery store, intending to do a quick sweep of the area before stopping by the station for lunch. As he turned onto Main Street, his eyes caught sight of a little girl sitting alone on a bench outside the Riverton Grocery Mart. She was holding a plush dog, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden bench. Riley slowed his patrol car, narrowing his eyes as he observed her. Something about the scene tugged at his instincts. A child sitting alone outside a store. It wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't typical either. In his years on the force, he'd seen plenty of cases where kids were used as lookouts or decoys, trained to distract attention while adults did the dirty work inside. Riley parked his cruiser across the street, keeping his engine running as he continued to watch the girl. She seemed calm, too calm, as if she was waiting for something. Her eyes darted occasionally to the store entrance, then back to the sidewalk. To Riley, it looked like the behavior of someone waiting for a signal, watching for an accomplice. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He reached for his radio but then hesitated, deciding to check it out himself. Riley got out of the car, adjusting his belt and resting one hand near his sidearm out of habit. He approached the girl slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel as he crossed the street. "Hey there," he called out, his voice carrying a note of authority. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. She clutched her stuffed animal a little tighter, but she managed a small smile. "I'm waiting for my mommy. She's inside shopping." Riley studied her closely, noting the nervous edge in her voice, the way her hands fidgeted with the plush dog's ears. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, keeping his tone firm. The girl bit her lip, glancing toward the store entrance. Not too long. Mommy said she'd be quick." Riley glanced around, scanning the area for any signs of suspicious activity. He saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the usual morning bustle of people going in and out of the store, carrying bags of groceries. But he couldn't shake the sense that something was off, that this little girl wasn't telling him everything. "Are you sure you're not waiting for someone else?" He pressed, leaning down slightly, so he was eye level with her. "Maybe you're keeping an eye out for someone?" The girl's eyes widened and she shook her head vigorously. "No, sir. I'm just waiting for my mommy," she insisted, her voice trembling with a note of panic that Riley interpreted as guilt. In that moment, Riley made a decision. He couldn't let this go, couldn't risk being wrong. He'd seen too many cases where a small oversight turned into a bigger problem. He reached out and took hold of the girl's arm, his grip firm but not painful. "I'm going to need you to come with me," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The girl's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched her stuffed animal tighter, her small body tensing as she tried to pull away. "No, please. I didn't do anything. My mommy's inside," she cried, her voice breaking. Riley ignored her protests, his focus entirely on what he believed he needed to do. He led her toward his patrol car, intending to put her inside until he could sort out what was really going on. But as he did, a crowd began to gather, drawn by the sight of a police officer detaining a crying child inside the grocery store. Alicia had just reached the produce section when she realized she had spent more time than she intended. She glanced at her phone, feeling a twinge of guilt. She hoped Lily wasn't getting too bored waiting outside. She grabbed the strawberries that had caught her eye earlier, thinking about how Lily's face would light up when they made the shortcake later. As she made her way to the checkout, Alicia's thoughts drifted. She thought about the neighborhood meeting she was planning to attend that night, about the upcoming rent that loomed over her like a storm cloud, and about the small but persistent ache in her chest whenever she thought of her ex-husband, wondering if things could have been different if they had tried harder. But she pushed those thoughts aside. She had more pressing things to focus on, like making sure Lily had a safe and happy childhood, no matter what. She paid for her groceries and balanced the bags in her arms as she headed toward the store exit. But as she stepped outside, she noticed a crowd gathered near the entrance. Alicia's heart skipped a beat, a sense of unease crawling up her spine. She pushed her way through the crowd, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what was happening. There, just a few feet away, was Lily, her sweet, gentle daughter, crying as a police officer dragged her toward a patrol car. Alicia's vision tunneled, and she dropped her bags without a second thought, sprinting toward them. "Let her go! That's my daughter!" Alicia shouted, her voice breaking through the murmur of the crowd. She reached out, trying to pull Lily out of the officer's grip, but he stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Ma'am, step back," the officer barked, his tone sharp with authority. "Your daughter is being detained for questioning. I need you to let me do my job." Alicia felt a surge of anger rise inside her, a hot, burning fury that made her hands tremble. "She's 9 years old. She hasn't done anything wrong. You have no right to put your hands on her." Her voice cracked, but she refused to back down, even as the officer's eyes hardened. Around them, the crowd grew larger, their whispers turning into murmurs of confusion and disbelief. A few people raised their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. Alicia's heart pounded in her chest, a sickening mix of fear and rage making her feel like she might explode. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, I'm going to have to take further action," the officer warned, his hand hovering near his radio. But Alicia couldn't hear him over the sound of her own heartbeat, the desperate need to protect her daughter drowning out everything else. "Please, just let her go. She's scared. Can't you see that?" Alicia pleaded, her voice breaking as she tried to reach out to Lily again. But the officer's stance remained rigid, unmoved by her desperation. Lily's cries grew louder, her small voice cutting through the morning air. "Mommy, please, I didn't do anything. I just want to go home." The sight of her daughter's tear-streaked face, her small body trembling with fear, shattered something inside Alicia. She took a step closer, her voice rising to a near shout. "I want to speak to your supervisor. You can't just take my child away." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. He glanced around, noticing the phone recording, the growing tension in the crowd. He hesitated, and Alicia saw the moment when doubt crept into his mind. A voice from the crowd called out, "Let her go, officer! She didn't do anything! She's just a kid!" Others murmured in agreement, and the officer's grip on Lily's arm slackened slightly. He glanced back at Alicia, then down at Lily, who looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. All right, we'll review the footage inside, he said at last, his voice quieter but still tense. If it shows that she didn't do anything, she'll be free to go. Alicia didn't trust herself to speak. She scooped Lily into her arms, holding her daughter tightly as if she could shield her from everything that had happened. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on them, the judgment and the sympathy mingling in a way that made her skin crawl. But all she could focus on was Lily's quiet sobs, the way her small hands clung to her shirt. Together, they followed the officer and the store manager inside, the tension following them like a shadow. And as they walked through the automatic doors, Alicia knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The store manager, Mr. Green, led them to the small, cramped security room at the back of the grocery store. The space was dimly lit, filled with flickering monitors showing various angles of the store. The walls were lined with shelves stacked high with dusty binders and old files, giving the room a slightly claustrophobic feel. Alicia clutched Lily tightly to her side, refusing to let go of her daughter's hand. Lily had buried her face against her mother's side, her small body still trembling with residual fear. Officer Riley Adams followed them inside, his face flushed and tense, his eyes darting from the monitors to Alicia and back again. Mr. Green cleared his throat, his expression nervous as he glanced between Alicia and Riley. He adjusted his glasses and began rewinding the footage, his fingers shaking slightly as they tapped against the keyboard. "This'll just take a minute," he murmured, avoiding eye contact with both of them. Alicia kept her focus on Lily, brushing a stray tear from her daughter's cheek. "It's okay, sweetie. We're going to get this sorted out, okay? Just stay with me." Her voice was low, but the anger simmering beneath her words was unmistakable. Riley shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms over his chest as he tried to regain his composure. He had always prided himself on being in control of situations like this, but now he felt like he was on the edge of losing that control completely. His mind raced, replaying the events of the last hour, trying to convince himself that he hadn't made a mistake. But as he looked at the fear etched into Lily's small face, doubt clawed at his insides. Mr. Green finally found the right footage, and the screen flickered as the video played. They all watched in silence as the grainy black and white footage showed Lily sitting quietly on the bench outside the store, her legs swinging back and forth. She hugged Maxie to her chest, occasionally looking around with the innocent curiosity of a child. The minutes passed, and it became clear that there was nothing suspicious in her behavior. No sign that she was acting as a lookout or waiting for anyone. She was just a little girl, alone and patiently waiting for her mother to return. The video showed her smiling at passers-by, humming to herself as she let her imagination wander. Alicia's eyes filled with fresh tears as she watched the video, her anger flaring up again as she turned to face Riley. "You see? She didn't do anything wrong. She was just sitting there waiting for me. You had no right to treat her like a criminal." Riley's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he watched the video replay what he had already realized. He had been wrong. He had let his instincts lead him astray, misreading a simple situation because he thought he knew better. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he couldn't bring himself to look at Alicia. I see that now," Riley said, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to Alicia, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake." Alicia's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes blazing with fury. "A mistake? Do you call this a mistake? You scared my daughter half to death. You put your hands on her, dragged her away. How do you think she'll ever trust a police officer again?" Riley swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had thought his apology might diffuse the situation, but it was like pouring water on a fire, useless against the heat of Alicia's rage. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had nothing that could undo the damage he had caused, no excuse that would make this right. Mr. Green cleared his throat again, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Officer, I think you'd better leave," he said, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "There's no reason for you to be here anymore." Riley glanced at the store manager, then back at Alicia and Lily. He took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his mistake. "Yeah, I'll leave." He turned on his heel and walked out of the security room, his footsteps heavy on the tile floor. As he pushed through the front doors of the store, the murmur of the crowd outside washed over him like a wave of judgment. He kept his head down as he made his way back to his patrol car, feeling the sting of their eyes on him, the cameras that captured his every move. He climbed into the cruiser and shut the door, but he didn't start the engine right away. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And all he could think was that he had failed. Failed himself, failed his training, and most of all, failed the very people he was supposed to protect. Inside the grocery store, Alicia gathered Lily into her arms, holding her daughter tightly as they walked back through the aisles. Her hands were still shaking, and she could feel her heart racing in her chest. The adrenaline that had fueled her confrontation now draining away, leaving behind a raw, aching emptiness. Lily clung to her small fingers digging into the fabric of her mother's shirt. As they reached the checkout line, Mr. Green came up behind them, his face pinched with concern. "I'm so sorry about all this, Alicia," he said quietly, handing her a few items she had dropped when she ran outside. "I don't know what that officer was thinking, but if you need any help, just let me know, okay?" Alicia nodded, managing a tight smile. "Thanks, Mr. Green. I appreciate it. I need to get her home." Mr. Green nodded, stepping back as Alicia paid for the groceries and then headed out of the store, her grip on Lily's hand never loosening. As they stepped outside, Alicia noticed that the crowd had mostly dispersed, though a few people still lingered, whispering to each other and glancing at her with sympathetic looks. Alicia ignored them, focusing on getting Lily back to their car. But as she buckled Lily into the back seat, she noticed that a few people were still recording with their phones. A young woman with bright red hair stepped forward, her expression serious. "Hey, I just want you to know that I recorded what happened. If you need it, I can send it to you." What he did, it wasn't right. Alicia paused, looking at the woman for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I might take you up on that." The woman nodded, handing over a card with her contact information before stepping back. Alicia climbed into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She drove home in silence, the weight of what had happened pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. Back at their apartment, Alicia helped Lily change into her pajamas, trying to keep her own emotions in check. But as she tucked Lily into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "Mommy, why did the policeman think I was bad? I didn't do anything." Alicia's heart broke at the question, and she felt tears spill down her cheeks before she could stop them. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I don't know, baby, but you didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault, okay? I promise you, we're going to make sure he knows that." Lily nodded, her small hands clutching Maxie to her chest. "Okay, Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But what if he comes back?" Alicia felt a fresh wave of anger surge through her. She wrapped her arms around Lily, holding her daughter tightly. "He won't, sweetie. I won't let him. No one is ever going to hurt you like that again." Across town, Riley sat alone in his apartment, a beer bottle resting on the coffee table in front of him. The glow of the television cast harsh shadows across the room, but he wasn't really watching the program that flickered on the screen. His mind was replaying the events of the day over and over again, each time magnifying his mistakes. He pulled out his phone and opened social media, only to find his own face staring back at him from video clips that had already gone viral. The footage showed him grabbing Lily's arm, the harshness in his voice as he confronted Alicia. He scrolled through the comments, his gut twisting at the anger and disgust aimed in his direction. What kind of cop does this to a kid? This is why people don't trust the police anymore. She's just a child. How can anyone justify this? Riley's hands shook as he tossed the phone aside, letting it clatter onto the floor. He leaned forward, pressing his hands to his face as the reality of what he'd done sank in. He had thought he was doing the right thing, protecting his community, but now he could see the truth. He had let his fear, his biases, and his need for control blind him to what was right in front of him. He didn't sleep that night, staring up at the dark ceiling as he thought about Lily's tears, Alicia's rage, and the judgmental eyes of the crowd. He couldn't escape the weight of it, the sense that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The next morning, his phone rang with a call from Captain Collins, summoning him to the precinct. Riley knew that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. He braced himself for the fallout, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that he deserved whatever was coming. The story of what happened outside Riverton Grocery Mart spread quickly. It started with the videos posted on social media, clips that racked up thousands of views in a matter of hours. People shared the footage, adding their own commentary, calling for justice, and demanding answers from the Riverton Police Department. By the following afternoon, local news outlets had picked up the story, broadcasting segments that showed the confrontation outside the store. Headlines like, "9-year-old detained by Riverton police officer sparks outrage," flashed across the screen, accompanied by interviews with bystanders who had witnessed the incident. Alicia found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated. Her phone rang constantly, calls and texts from reporters, community leaders, and friends who offered their support. Even Daniel King, a community activist she had met at local meetings, reached out, offering to help organize a response. Daniel met with Alicia at a local coffee shop, listening as she recounted what had happened, her voice trembling with anger and exhaustion. "I don't know what to do, Daniel. All I wanted was for them to treat my daughter like a person. But now it feels like everyone's watching us." Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "Alicia, this isn't just about what happened to Lily. It's about what's been happening for a long time. People feeling like their kids aren't safe, like the people who are supposed to protect them don't see them as human. You have a chance here to make a difference." Alicia shook her head, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I'm not an activist, Daniel. I'm just trying to keep my daughter safe." "And that's exactly why you're the right person for this," Daniel insisted. "You're fighting for your child, and there's power in that. But you don't have to do it alone. We can stand together, make sure the police are held accountable. If you're willing to take this to the next level, I can help you get there." Alicia hesitated, glancing out the window at the town she had always called home. It felt like everything she knew was changing, slipping out of her control. But when she thought about the fear in Lily's eyes, the way her daughter had clung to her in the car, she knew that she couldn't let this go. "Okay," Alicia said finally, her voice firm with resolve. "Let's do it. Let's make sure they can't ignore us." Meanwhile, the fallout inside the Riverton Police Department was just beginning. At the precinct, officers exchanged uneasy glances as they watched the news segments about the incident. Some of Riley's colleagues defended him, arguing that he had only been doing his job, but others were less sympathetic. Officer Emma Willis, a close friend of Riley's, confronted him in the locker room after he was called into Captain Collins' office. "Riley, what the hell happened out there?" she asked, her tone sharp with frustration. "Do you realize what kind of damage you've done? People already don't trust us, and now you've given them even more reason not to." Riley turned to face her, his expression weary. "I know, Emma. I know I messed up. I thought I was doing the right thing." Emma shook her head, crossing her arms over her chest. "You need to start asking yourself why you thought that. Because from where I'm standing, all you did was terrify a little girl and her mother. And now we're all paying the price for it." She walked away before Riley could respond, leaving him standing alone in the echoing silence of the locker room. He knew she was right, and as he made his way to the captain's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the reckoning he would have to face. Alicia sat at her kitchen table, staring down at the open laptop in front of her. It was late, and the apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional sound of a car passing outside. Lily was asleep in the bedroom, her breathing even and peaceful, but Alicia couldn't stop replaying the events of that awful day over and over in her mind. She had spent hours researching her options, combing through websites, reading articles about other families who had faced similar situations, other parents who had tried to hold the police accountable. Her search had led her to Melissa Evans, a lawyer based in a nearby city with a reputation for taking on tough cases involving civil rights and police misconduct. Alicia hesitated before typing out a message to her, unsure of what to say, unsure if she even had the strength to see this through. But then she thought of Lily's tear-filled eyes, the way her daughter had clung to her, terrified that the officer would come back. Alicia's hands steadied on the keyboard, and she typed a message, explaining what had happened and asking if Melissa would be willing to take the case. She read it over once, then hit send before she could change her mind. The next morning, her phone rang with a call from Melissa. The lawyer's voice was calm and assured as she introduced herself and asked Alicia to come in for a consultation. Alicia agreed, feeling a sense of determination settled in her chest like a steel rod. A few days later, Alicia sat in Melissa's office, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a bustling city street. Melissa was a woman in her early 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a confident demeanor that made her seem taller than she was. She listened carefully as Alicia recounted what had happened, her hands folded on the desk, her expression growing more focused with each detail. "I've seen this before," Melissa said, leaning back in her chair as she made notes on a yellow legal pad. "An officer oversteps his bounds, a family is traumatized, and then they try to sweep it under the rug. But we don't have to let that happen, Alicia. If you're willing to fight, I think we have a strong case. We can pursue a lawsuit for unlawful detainment and emotional distress, and we can use this to push for broader reforms within the police department." Alicia's hands twisted together in her lap, her nerves humming with anxiety. "I don't want to drag Lily through more pain," she said softly, "but I also don't want her to grow up thinking that this is just how the world is, that it's okay for people to treat her like she doesn't matter." Melissa nodded, her expression softening. "I understand, Alicia. This won't be easy, and it will put you in the spotlight. But if we do this, it could make a difference, not just for Lily, but for other families too." Alicia took a deep breath, then nodded. "Let's do it," she said, her voice firm. "Let's make sure they can't ignore us." Across town, Riley stood in Captain Collins' office, feeling like a child waiting for a scolding. The captain sat behind his desk, his expression hard as he flipped through a stack of reports. The blinds were drawn, casting sharp shadows across the room, and the air was thick with tension. "You know why I called you in here, Adams?" Captain Collins asked without looking up, his voice flat and controlled. Riley swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir. It's about the incident at the grocery store." Captain Collins dropped the reports onto his desk with a thud, finally meeting Riley's eyes. "It's more than an incident, Adams. It's a goddamn mess. I've got reporters calling my office every hour, community leaders demanding action, and now I hear that the family is considering a lawsuit. Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost the department?" Riley's jaw tightened, shame and frustration warring inside him. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought the kid was being used as a decoy. I just wanted to keep people safe." Collins leaned forward, his expression icy. "You let your assumptions get the better of you, Riley, and now we're all paying for it. The department is putting you on administrative leave, effective immediately. There's going to be an internal review, and if the family does go through with a lawsuit, we'll be looking at an external investigation too." Riley felt like the floor had dropped out from beneath him. "Administrative leave? But sir, You crossed a line, Adams," Collins interrupted, his voice harsh. "And you need to understand that there are consequences for that. Turn in your badge and your gun and get out of my office." Riley felt a surge of anger, a desire to argue that he was being treated unfairly, that he hadn't meant for things to go this far. But deep down, he knew that there was no defending what he had done. He reached for his badge, feeling the weight of it in his hand before he placed it on the captain's desk, along with his service weapon. As he walked out of the precinct, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some sympathetic, others cold and judgmental. Officer Emma Willis caught his eye as he passed by, but she said nothing, just shook her head slightly, a look of disappointment in her eyes that cut deeper than any words. Riley left the precinct, stepping out into the midday sun that felt far too bright. He climbed into his car and sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the dashboard. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who did his job well. But now he felt like a stranger to himself, adrift in a sea of doubt and regret. He spent the next few days alone in his small apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping. He watched the news segments about the growing protests in Riverton, about the calls for accountability and change. Each story, each interview with Alicia or Daniel King felt like a knife twisting in his chest, a reminder that he had become the very thing he had always prided himself on standing against. But he couldn't turn it off, couldn't stop himself from watching, as if he needed to see the full extent of what he had caused. And as the days passed, a grim determination began to settle in his mind, a sense that he needed to do something, to face what he had done, even if he didn't know where to begin. It started small, a group of neighbors gathering outside the Riverton Police Department, holding signs that read, "Justice for Lily and End Police Violence." Alicia stood among them, her hands gripping the edges of a homemade sign that Lily had helped decorate with red and blue marker. She felt awkward and self-conscious, aware of the eyes on her, aware of the cameras that had been set up by local news crews. But she also felt a sense of resolve, a determination to make sure that her voice was heard. Daniel King took the megaphone, his voice carrying over the sound of cars passing by on Main Street. "We're here today because we are tired of being afraid," he called out, his tone passionate. "We're tired of seeing our kids treated like they don't matter, tired of being told that we just have to accept things the way they are. We demand change. We demand accountability." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in a wave that echoed off the brick walls of the nearby buildings. Alicia glanced over at Lily, who stood beside her, looking up at the signs with wide eyes. She worried about exposing Lily to all this, but she also knew that her daughter needed to see that they were fighting back, that they weren't just going to accept what had happened. After Daniel's speech, Alicia took a deep breath and stepped up to the megaphone. She felt the weight of every eye on her, felt the pressure of being the face of this movement, but she forced herself to speak. "My daughter is 9 years old," she began, her voice shaky but gaining strength as she went on. "And she was treated like a criminal just because she was sitting on a bench waiting for me. That's not right. That's not what justice looks like. I'm standing here today because I don't want any other child to go through what Lily went through. I want the police to do better, to be better, and I won't stop fighting until that happens." As the crowd applauded, Alicia stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel gave her a reassuring smile, squeezing her shoulder. "You're doing great, Alicia. People are listening." Alicia nodded, feeling a swell of hope despite the fear that still gnawed at her. She glanced over at Lily, who reached up to take her hand, and she knew that no matter how hard this fight became, she wouldn't back down. Riley sat in the back of the town hall meeting, blending into the shadows as best he could. He had come hoping to find some way to understand the anger that was sweeping through Riverton, hoping to see the faces behind the signs, behind the stories that had turned his life upside down. He listened as residents took turns at the microphone, sharing their stories of feeling targeted, ignored, dismissed by the police. Some spoke with anger, others with tears, but all of them shared a sense of betrayal, of feeling like the people sworn to protect them saw them as suspects first and human beings second. When Alicia took the stage, Riley felt his breath caught in his throat. She was composed but fierce, her voice carrying a conviction that he couldn't ignore. "I want to believe that we can change," she said, looking out at the audience. "I want to believe that the police can learn to see us as more than threats, that they can learn to protect our children instead of making them afraid. But that won't happen unless we demand it. It won't happen unless we hold them accountable." Riley felt a surge of shame as he listened to her words, knowing that he was part of what had brought her to this point. He thought about stepping forward, about trying to speak, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not yet. He didn't know if he deserved to. As the meeting came to an end, Riley slipped out the back door, his mind a whirl of thoughts. He knew that he couldn't change what he had done, couldn't undo the pain he had caused, but he also knew that he couldn't ignore it, couldn't run from it. If he had any chance of making things right, he would have to start by facing the truth of his actions, no matter how painful that truth might be. Alicia's apartment had become a war room. Her small living room, usually a place of quiet refuge after long days of work, was now filled with stacks of legal paperwork, folders full of witness statements, and highlighted transcripts from interviews. The space was cramped with the weight of her determination, each document a step closer to holding the police accountable for what had happened to Lily. Melissa Evans, Alicia's lawyer, sat across from her, flipping through a stack of depositions. Her expression was focused and unyielding, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She had been working late into the night for weeks, building their case piece by piece. "We're making progress," Melissa said, her voice calm but edged with the gravity of their task. "We have statements from the witnesses at the grocery store, the video footage from the security cameras, and the social media posts from people who recorded the incident. All of this will help establish that there was no probable cause for detaining Lily." Alicia nodded, glancing down at the papers spread out on the coffee table. She had read them all a dozen times, memorizing every word, every piece of evidence that might convince a judge or jury to see what she and Lily had suffered. But the weight of it all still pressed down on her, a constant reminder of how much she was risking. "What about Riley Adams?" Alicia asked, her voice low. She could barely bring herself to say his name without feeling a surge of anger. "Will he be there? Will he have to answer for what he did?" Melissa hesitated, folding her hands on top of the file she had been reading. "Yes, he'll be there," she said carefully, "and he'll have to testify. But he's going to have a lawyer of his own, and they're going to try to paint this as a misunderstanding. We need to be prepared for them to shift blame, to try and make it sound like he was just doing his job." Alicia's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles turning white. "He wasn't doing his job. He was reckless. He scared my daughter half to death. And now he thinks he can just apologize and walk away from it?" Melissa reached out, placing a hand on Alicia's arm. "I know, Alicia, but the best thing we can do right now is stay focused. If we present a clear, compelling case, we can win. And if we win, it could set a precedent, not just for you and Lily, but for other families too." Alicia took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. "You're right. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what I need to do." Melissa nodded, her expression softening. "For now, just keep telling your story. The more people know what happened, the harder it will be for them to ignore us." A few days later, Alicia found herself sitting across from a reporter from a national news network, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to steady her breathing. The reporter, a young woman with a sympathetic smile, leaned forward, her notebook opened in front of her. "Thank you for speaking with us, Alicia," the reporter began, her voice gentle. "I know this must be difficult, but I think it's important for people to hear your side of the story. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened that day?" Alicia glanced toward the closed bedroom door, where Lily was playing with her toys, then back at the reporter. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "It was supposed to be a normal day. I just needed to grab a few things from the grocery store, and I asked Lily to wait on the bench outside, like I'd done before. She promised me she'd stay right there, and she did." Her voice wavered as she continued, and she had to pause to gather herself. "When I came outside and saw that officer dragging her toward his car, she was crying, and he wouldn't listen to me when I told him she hadn't done anything. He just treated her like she was a threat, like she was something to be afraid of." The reporter nodded, making notes as Alicia spoke. "And how has Lily been since the incident? How has it affected her?" Alicia pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ache that never quite went away. "She doesn't sleep through the night anymore. She wakes up crying, afraid that the police are going to come take her away. I've tried to tell her that she's safe now, but I don't know if I believe it myself." Her voice cracked, and she blinked back tears, refusing to break down in front of the camera. The reporter reached out, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "Thank you, Alicia. I know this is hard, but your bravery means a lot to so many people." As the interview wrapped up, Alicia felt a mix of exhaustion and hope settled in her chest. She didn't know what kind of difference her words would make, but she knew that staying silent was no longer an option. Riley sat alone in the dimly lit bar at the edge of town, nursing a whiskey that he'd barely touched. He had been coming here more often lately, finding solace in the quiet murmur of conversations and the hum of the neon lights. It was one of the few places where he could be alone with his thoughts, where he didn't have to face the judgmental eyes of his neighbors or the whispers that followed him through town. The bartender, a middle-aged man named Frank, wiped down the counter as he glanced at Riley. "You've been looking pretty rough lately, Adams," he said, his tone casual but edged with curiosity. "You want to talk about it?" Riley shook his head, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. "I don't know what there is to talk about, Frank. I messed up. Now I'm paying for it." Frank shrugged, leaning on the counter. "That's how it goes sometimes, kid. But if you keep hiding out in here, it's not going to make things any better. You want to make up for what you did? Maybe you should start by facing the people you hurt." Riley let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "Yeah, well, I'm not sure they want me anywhere near them, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't trust me either." Frank nodded, picking up another glass to dry. "Maybe, but staying in the shadows isn't going to help anyone either. You've got to decide if you want to keep running from it or if you want to try and do something about it." Riley didn't respond right away. He knew that Frank was right, but the thought of facing Alicia, of standing up in front of the community and admitting that he had failed, terrified him. He had built his whole identity around being a protector, someone who did the right thing even when it was hard. But now he felt like that identity had been shattered, and he didn't know how to put it back together. Eventually, he pushed away from the bar, tossing a few crumpled bills onto the counter. "Thanks, Frank," he muttered. "I'll think about it." As he walked out into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at a long, painful fall. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to climb back up, if he had the courage to take the first step. The protests outside the Riverton Police Department had grown larger in the weeks since Alicia's story had made national news. What had started as a small gathering of neighbors had swelled into a movement, with people from surrounding towns and cities joining in. Some came with signs demanding justice for Lily, others with banners calling for police reform, and a few with more personal messages, stories of their own experiences with profiling and mistreatment. Alicia and Daniel King worked tirelessly to keep the protests organized and peaceful. Daniel, with his natural charisma and experience in community organizing, became a leader in the movement, rallying people with his passionate speeches and calls for accountability. One chilly Saturday morning, Alicia and Daniel stood side by side on the steps of the community center, addressing a crowd of hundreds. Alicia still felt a knot of nervousness every time she spoke in front of so many people, but she had learned to channel it into determination. "We're not just here for one family," Daniel declared, his voice carrying over the heads of the crowd. "We're here for every parent who's been afraid to let their child walk to school alone, for every person who's felt like their voice doesn't matter. We're here because we believe that this town can do better, that it must do better." The crowd cheered, raising their signs in solidarity. Alicia stepped forward, taking the microphone from Daniel, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. "This isn't just about what happened to Lily," she said, her voice steady. "It's about making sure that no other child has to grow up feeling like they're seen as a threat, like they don't belong. We deserve better, and we won't stop until we get it." As the crowd roared their approval, Alicia caught sight of a familiar face at the back. Officer Emma Willis. Emma wasn't in uniform and she kept her distance, but her presence was a reminder that not everyone in the department was against them. Alicia didn't know what to make of it, but she nodded to Emma, a silent acknowledgement that things were changing, even if only a little. That night, Alicia sat on the couch with Lily, watching the local news coverage of the day's protest. The screen showed footage of the crowd, of Alicia speaking, her voice filled with conviction. Lily watched with wide eyes, clutching Maxie in her lap. "Mommy," she said quietly, looking up at Alicia, "are we going to win?" Alicia smiled down at her daughter, brushing a hand through her curls. "I don't know, sweetie, but we're going to try our best, and we're not alone." Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. She rested her head against her mother's shoulder, and Alicia wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. For the first time in weeks, Alicia felt a small, fragile sense of hope taking root inside her. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with fear and anger and doubt. But at least now, she wasn't walking it alone. The courthouse in Riverton had become a focal point for the town's growing tensions. On the morning of the preliminary hearing for Alicia Brooks' Riverton Police Department, reporters and community members gathered outside the courthouse steps, their voices rising in a chorus of hope, anger, and anticipation. The cold morning air was filled with the hum of news cameras and the murmur of anxious conversations. Inside, the courthouse felt like a different world, quiet, heavy with the sense that something important was about to unfold. Alicia walked through the courthouse doors, her hands clutching Lily's for comfort. Melissa Evans, her lawyer, walked beside her, her expression composed but determined. Alicia had spent countless nights worrying about this moment, about whether she had made the right choice in pursuing a lawsuit. She knew that speaking up meant exposing herself and Lily to even more scrutiny, more questions, more whispers from people who thought she should have let it go. But each time those doubts crept in, she remembered the terror in Lily's eyes, the way her daughter had clung to her like a lifeline, and she knew she couldn't turn back now. As they walked into the courtroom, Alicia felt the weight of every eye on her. She could see the tension in the faces of the police officers seated on one side of the room, the quiet determination in the faces of her supporters on the other. At the defense table sat Riley Adams, his head bowed as he conferred with his lawyer, John Porter, who was known for defending officers in high-profile cases. Riley's presence cast a shadow over the proceedings, a constant reminder of the confrontation that had set everything in motion. Lily squeezed her mother's hand, looking up at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Mommy, are they going to ask me a lot of questions?" Alicia knelt down, brushing a curl back from her daughter's face. "You might have to answer some questions, sweetie, but I'll be right there with you, and you don't have to be afraid. Just tell the truth, okay?" Lily nodded, clutching Maxie tighter to her chest. Alicia wished she could shield her from all of this, but she also knew that Lily needed to see that they were fighting back, that they weren't just going to let what happened fade into the background. The sound of a gavel brought the room to order, and Judge Taylor, a stern-looking woman with silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, addressed the court. "This hearing will determine whether this case proceeds to trial. I expect all parties to conduct themselves with professionalism and respect for this court." Melissa stood to give her opening remarks, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, this case is about more than one incident. It's about a culture of overreach and a failure to protect those who are most vulnerable. My client, Alicia Brooks, is seeking justice not just for her daughter Lily, but for every child in this community who deserves to feel safe in the presence of law enforcement." Riley's lawyer, John Porter, countered with a carefully rehearsed argument, emphasizing the complexities of policing and the difficult decisions officers had to make in the moment. He framed Riley's actions as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate mistake made by a dedicated officer who was simply trying to do his job. As the preliminary hearing continued, Alicia felt a surge of anger listening to Porter's words. He spoke about procedures, about Riley's instincts and training, but he didn't talk about Lily's fear, about how it felt to see her daughter treated like a suspect. Melissa's rebuttal was strong, pointing out the lack of evidence against Lily and highlighting the emotional damage caused by Riley's actions. But Alicia knew that their fight was far from over. At the end of the hearing, Judge Taylor announced that the case would proceed to trial, setting a date for a few weeks later. "I believe there are significant questions of fact that warrant a full trial. The court will hear both sides in detail before reaching a decision." Alicia let out a shaky breath, feeling a mix of relief and dread. This was what she had wanted, a chance to make their case, to hold the police accountable. But now that it was happening, she couldn't ignore the fear that twisted in her gut, the knowledge that the hardest part was still ahead. Back at home, the strain of the legal battle began to take its toll on Alicia and Lily. The media presence outside their apartment building made it impossible to ignore the constant scrutiny. Reporters camped out near the entrance, hoping for a soundbite or a moment of vulnerability. Alicia did her best to shield Lily from it, but it wasn't always possible. One evening, after another difficult day of preparing for trial with Melissa, Alicia sat on the couch, staring at the stack of mail on the kitchen table. Mixed in with the bills and advertisements were letters from strangers, some offering support, others filled with accusations and hatred. Alicia had learned to sort through them quickly, tossing the worst of them into the trash, but she couldn't stop the words from sticking in her mind. "You're just making things worse for everyone," one letter had said. "Why don't you just let it go and stop stirring up trouble?" Alicia clenched her hands into fists, crumpling the letter before throwing it into the trash. She turned when she heard a soft voice behind her. "Mommy?" Lily stood in the doorway, holding Maxie, her face pale and worried. "Why do people keep saying those things about us?" Alicia crossed the room and knelt in front of her daughter, wrapping her arms around her. "They don't understand, Lily. They don't know what happened to you, and they don't understand why we're standing up for ourselves. But we're not alone. There are lots of people who believe in what we're doing." Lily leaned into her mother's embrace, nodding against her shoulder. "I'm glad you're here, Mommy," she whispered. "I'm scared, but I know you'll protect me." Alicia blinked back tears, pressing a kiss to the top of her daughter's head. "I will, sweetie. I promise you, I'll keep fighting." Across town, Riley sat in his empty apartment, staring at the stacks of paperwork on his own kitchen table. Legal documents, notes from his lawyer, and pages of his own deposition. He had been replaying the preliminary hearing over and over in his mind, hearing Melissa's words as she described the pain and fear he had caused. Each time, the weight of his actions pressed down on him harder, making it impossible to sleep. He tried to distract himself by cleaning, by reading, by going for long runs through the quiet streets of Riverton, but nothing seemed to quiet the guilt that gnawed at him. He had started attending the sensitivity training sessions mandated as part of the department's response, but he found it hard to connect with the messages, hard to see how they applied to someone who had already failed so publicly. One evening, as Riley sat on his couch with a cold beer in hand, he found himself scrolling through social media, looking at the footage of the protests and reading the comments from people who believed he was a monster. He stumbled across a video clip from one of the community meetings where Alicia had spoken about what had happened to Lily. Her voice was filled with a raw pain that cut through him, and he found himself watching the video over and over, unable to look away. "I just want my daughter to be able to walk down the street without feeling like she has to prove that she belongs there," Alicia said in the video, her voice cracking. "I want her to know that she's seen and heard, not just treated like she's a problem to be solved." Riley felt a lump form in his throat, his hands tightening around his phone. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to try and explain himself. But he knew that no words could undo the damage he had caused, no apology could make up for what he had put them through. And so he stayed silent, knowing that he had lost any chance of being seen as anything other than the man who had hurt them. As the trial date approached, Riverton felt like a town on the edge of a knife. The divide between those who supported Alicia and those who defended the police department had grown deeper, and it seemed like every conversation in town turned into an argument. At the diner where Alicia worked, customers whispered to each other as she refilled their coffee cups, their eyes darting toward her like she was a ticking bomb. One morning, Daniel King met Alicia for coffee at a local cafe, hoping to strategize for the next community meeting. As they sat by the window, Daniel's expression was grim. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it, Alicia. The police union is putting a lot of pressure on the town council to side with them. They're saying that if you win this case, it's going to make it impossible for officers to do their jobs." Alicia set down her coffee cup, her jaw tightening. "They're acting like I'm the one who put my hands on Lily. All I want is for them to admit that they were wrong, that they should have treated her like a person." "I know," Daniel said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "And a lot of people in town see that too. But you've got to be prepared for a fight. It's going to get uglier before it gets better." Alicia nodded, trying to steel herself for what lay ahead. She knew that the closer they got to the trial, the more intense the pressure would become. But she also knew that backing down wasn't an option, not when so much was at stake. That same day, Riley attended a private meeting at the Riverton Police Department, where Captain Collins and the town's legal representatives gathered to discuss their strategy for the trial. The atmosphere was tense, and Riley couldn't shake the feeling that he was being weighed and measured by everyone in the room. Captain Collins was blunt as he addressed the group. "We need to be clear about what's at stake here. If we lose this case, it's going to open the door to more lawsuits, more public scrutiny. The department's reputation is on the line, and we can't afford to lose." Riley sat quietly as the lawyers discussed their strategy, listening as they talked about how to frame his actions as reasonable under the circumstances. But as they spoke, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had always thought of himself as someone who did what was right, but now he felt like he was being used as a pawn in a game that had little to do with justice. After the meeting, Riley lingered outside the precinct, looking up at the gray sky that loomed over Riverton like a storm cloud. He knew that whatever happened in the courtroom, it wouldn't change the damage that had already been done. And as he watched a group of protesters gather across the street, He wondered if he would ever be able to make things right, or if he would always be defined by the worst mistake of his life. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Rows of wooden benches were filled with reporters, community members, and curious residents who wanted to see how the case that had divided Riverton would play out. The air buzzed with anticipation, and the hum of voices filled the space like a low, persistent drone. Alicia sat at the plaintiff's table with Melissa beside her, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. Lily wasn't present. Melissa had insisted that it was better for her to stay at home with a friend until she was needed for testimony. Alicia agreed, but she felt a pang of sadness as she looked at the empty chair beside her. She wished she could be with her daughter right now, to remind her that they were doing this together. But she also knew that shielding Lily from the worst of the trial was the right decision. On the other side of the courtroom sat Riley and his lawyer, John Porter. Riley's expression was grim, his hands clasped tightly together on the table in front of him. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the people who had once been his neighbors, his friends. But now their expressions ranged from curious to hostile, and Riley could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. It was like being on the other side of a glass wall, separated from the community he had once served. Judge Taylor called the courtroom to order, and the opening statements began. Melissa stood first, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the jury. This case is about accountability, about ensuring that those who are meant to serve and protect us do so without prejudice, without bias, and without inflicting unnecessary harm. On that day, Riley Adams treated a 9-year-old girl as if she was a criminal, without any evidence, without any justification. The trauma that Lily and her mother, Alicia, have suffered is undeniable. And today, we are asking for justice. Melissa's words struck like a hammer blow, and Alicia saw several jurors nodding along, their expressions serious. But she also knew that Riley's defense would be ready with their own narrative, one that painted him as a man doing his best in difficult circumstances. Sure enough, when John Porter rose to give his opening statement, he emphasized the pressures of policing, the split-second decisions that officers had to make in uncertain situations. Riley Adams is a dedicated officer who made a mistake based on a genuine concern for the safety of this community, Porter said, his tone sympathetic but firm. We are not here to debate the tragedy of that mistake. We are here to decide whether it was a deliberate act of harm or the unfortunate result of trying to protect Riverton. We ask you to keep that distinction in mind as you hear the evidence. Alicia clenched her hands under the table, resisting the urge to shout back that it wasn't just a mistake. It was her daughter's life, her daughter's fear that they were talking about. But she forced herself to stay calm, knowing that they had to play by the rules of the courtroom if they wanted to win. The trial continued over the next few days, with both sides presenting their evidence and calling witnesses to the stand. Mr. Green, the store manager, was the first to testify for Alicia's side, describing how he had reviewed the security footage with Riley and Alicia on that day. I saw Lily sitting on the bench, just like her mother said, Mr. Green testified, his voice steady. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting there with her stuffed animal. It didn't make any sense to me why Officer Adams thought she needed to be taken in. Melissa guided him through the questioning, emphasizing the innocence of Lily's behavior and the lack of any reason to suspect her of wrongdoing. John Porter, however, was quick to push back during cross-examination, trying to undermine the idea that Riley had acted recklessly. Mr. Green, in your experience as a store manager, have you ever had incidents of children being used as lookouts or distractions during thefts? Porter asked, his tone pointed. Mr. Green hesitated, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. I mean, sure, we've had kids try to sneak things, but... And would you agree that it's possible for a trained officer to recognize signs of that behavior better than the average citizen? Porter pressed, his voice smooth. Alicia watched with a growing sense of frustration as Porter worked to frame Riley's actions as cautious rather than harmful. She could see how he was trying to shift the narrative, to plant doubt in the minds of the jurors. But Melissa countered with precision, redirecting the conversation back to the facts of that day, to the fear and trauma that Lily had experienced. When it came time for Alicia to take the stand, she felt her heart hammering in her chest. She met Melissa's gaze, drawing strength from the lawyer's steady expression, then faced the jury. "I trusted the police to keep my daughter safe," Alicia said, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "I never thought that the person who was supposed to protect her would be the one to make her feel so scared. She was just sitting there, waiting for me, and he treated her like she was a threat. I can't forget the way she looked at me when I found her. She thought I couldn't protect her, and that's not something you can just take back." She could see the empathy in the faces of some jurors, the way a few of them leaned forward, hanging on her every word. But she also knew that the case was far from over. As she stepped down from the stand, she caught a glimpse of Riley, his face drawn and pale. For a brief moment, she thought she saw regret in his eyes, but she pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter what he felt. Only what he had done. Riley's turn on the witness stand came 2 days later. He wore a suit, his expression carefully controlled as he faced questions from his lawyer. But inside, he was a mess, the knots of anxiety and guilt tightening with every passing minute. Porter guided him through his testimony, giving him the chance to explain his thought process on that day. Riley spoke about his training, about how he had been taught to be wary of unusual behavior, how he believed he was preventing a potential crime. He spoke about the pressure he felt as an officer, the need to make decisions quickly in a job where mistakes could have serious consequences. But when Melissa took over for cross-examination, her questions were sharp, cutting through his carefully rehearsed responses. "Officer Adams, you've spoken about your concerns for public safety. But what about Lily's safety? Did you ever consider how your actions might impact her?" Riley's hands clenched together, his throat tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. I thought I was doing what was necessary to keep the community safe," he said, but his voice wavered under the weight of the question. Melissa didn't let up. "But you had no evidence that Lily was involved in any wrongdoing. Isn't it true that you assumed she was a threat because of your own biases?" Riley felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, struggling for a response, but all he could think about was the look on Lily's face that day, the terror in her eyes. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had done, and he couldn't hide behind his training or his excuses anymore. "Yes," he said finally, his voice breaking. I think I made assumptions that weren't fair, and I'm sorry for what I did." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Alicia felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sorrow, but also a flicker of something like understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first time she had seen Riley acknowledge what he had done. She turned her gaze back to the judge, reminding herself that the outcome wasn't about personal feelings. It was about justice for Lily. Outside the courtroom, the tension in Riverton continued to escalate. News crews broadcast daily updates on the trial, dissecting every testimony and analyzing each moment of drama. The divide between those who supported Alicia and those who defended the police department grew even sharper, and conversations in cafes, at church gatherings, and in neighborhood meetings became heated. One afternoon, after a particularly intense day in court, Alicia found herself face-to-face with Officer Emma Willis outside the courthouse. Emma was dressed in plain clothes, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and sincerity. "I heard what you said on the stand," Emma said, shifting uncomfortably as she met Alicia's gaze. I want you to know that not everyone in the department agrees with what happened that day. Some of us think Riley crossed a line, and we're trying to change things, even if it doesn't seem like it." Alicia studied Emma for a long moment, her mind spinning with conflicting emotions. "It's going to take more than a few good intentions to fix this, Emma," she said finally, her voice weary. "But thank you for saying that. I hope you mean it." Emma nodded, and for the first time, Alicia saw a glimmer of hope in the officer's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that change, real change, was possible, even if it felt far away. Across town, Riley found himself increasingly isolated, avoiding the places he used to frequent, avoiding the faces that reminded him of what he had lost. He knew that the trial was turning him into a symbol of everything people hated about the system, and he couldn't escape the feeling that he had let everyone down. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his apartment building, he was surprised when a familiar figure approached. Frank, the bartender from the edge of town. "You look like you could use a drink," Frank said, holding out a paper bag with a bottle inside. "And maybe someone to listen." Riley took the bottle, nodding his thanks as Frank sat down beside him. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the sunset over the town that had once felt like home. Eventually, Riley spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Do you think there's any way to make this right, Frank? Or am I just fooling myself?" Frank took a long sip from his own bottle, staring out at the horizon. "I don't know, kid, but I think the only way to find out is to keep trying. Maybe you can't fix what happened, but you can't run from it either." Riley nodded, the words settling heavily in his chest. He knew that facing the truth of his actions wouldn't be enough to undo the harm he'd caused, but it was a start, and maybe, just maybe it was a chance to become something better than he had been. The courtroom was charged with a sense of finality as the trial entered its last days. The tension that had simmered throughout the case now hung in the air, thick and heavy, as both sides prepared to deliver their closing arguments. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and a hushed anticipation fell over the room as Judge Taylor called the court to order. Alicia sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on the reporters scribbling notes, on the faces of the community members who had come to support her, and on the jury that would soon decide the fate of the case. Her heart ached with a mixture of anxiety and hope, knowing that everything she had fought for was now in the hands of 12 strangers. Melissa stood and began her closing statement, her voice clear and firm as she faced the jury. What happened to Lily Brooks on that day was not just a mistake, it was a failure of judgment, a failure of compassion, and a failure to see a child for what she was, an innocent 9-year-old girl who was waiting for her mother. We are asking for accountability because without it, this pattern of fear and mistrust will continue to harm families in this community. Melissa walked slowly across the room, making eye contact with each juror as she spoke. Lily has been living with the fear that this might happen again, and Alicia has had to rebuild her daughter's sense of safety from the ground up. We cannot change what happened, but we can ensure that it never happens again. We ask you to hold the Riverton Police Department accountable for their actions and to send a message that every child in this community deserves to feel safe. The jury was rapt, their expressions thoughtful as they listened to Melissa's words. Alicia felt a swell of pride and gratitude for her lawyer, but she knew that the defense still had their turn to sway the jury. John Porter rose, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury box. He exuded calm, practiced confidence, and his voice was soothing as he spoke. This case is not about whether Officer Adams made a mistake. He admitted that he did, but mistakes are not the same as malicious intent. My client believed that he was acting in the best interest of the community, even if his judgment was flawed. To hold him personally accountable, to label him as the villain in this story, is to ignore the challenges that come with protecting our town. Porter gestured toward Riley, who sat with his head bowed, looking as small as Alicia had ever seen him. Officer Adams has served this town for over a decade. He has been on the front lines, risking his life to keep Riverton safe. We ask you to consider the pressures that officers face and to recognize that sometimes even good people make mistakes. The law allows for understanding, and we hope you will find that understanding here today. The courtroom fell silent as Porter returned to his seat and Judge Taylor dismissed the jury for deliberation. As the jury filed out of the room, Alicia felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. It was out of her hands now, and all she could do was wait. The hours that followed felt like a lifetime. Alicia and Melissa waited in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, the air thick with tension. Alicia kept glancing at her phone, reading and rereading the messages of support that had poured in from friends, from neighbors, and from people she didn't even know. But despite the outpouring of solidarity, she couldn't shake the gnawing fear that had settled in her chest. Melissa sat across from her, organizing her notes into neat stacks, but Alicia could tell that even her lawyer was anxious. They spoke in quiet tones, rehashing the evidence and trying to predict what the jury might decide. But there was no way to know for sure. Alicia's mind kept drifting to Lily, who was with a family friend, trying to distract herself with a movie and a game of cards. "Do you think we'll win?" Alicia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Melissa looked up, offering a small reassuring smile. I think we made a strong case. But whatever happens, Alicia, you did everything you could. No one can take that away from you. Alicia nodded, clinging to those words even as uncertainty churned inside her. She thought about how far they had come, about all the late nights of preparation and the courage it had taken to stand up in front of the courtroom. She knew that even if the verdict wasn't in their favor, she had made a difference. She had given Lily a chance to see that they could fight back Riley. Meanwhile, sat alone in the lobby outside the courtroom, staring out the window at the gray sky. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, cameras trained on the entrance, waiting to capture the moment the verdict was announced. He had avoided them, keeping his head down as he walked through the back entrance. He couldn't bear to see the flash of cameras, to hear the shouted questions about whether he regretted his actions. He thought about the last few weeks, about how everything in his life had unraveled. He had alienated his colleagues, lost respect for his community, and watched as the town he had once sworn to protect turned against him. And through it all, he couldn't escape the knowledge that he deserved their anger. He had hoped that the trial might bring some kind of closure, some way to move forward. But now as he waited for the jury's decision, he realized that there might not be any closure for him, not in the way he had imagined. All he could do was face whatever came next. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom was packed once again, the air thick with anticipation. Alicia's hands shook as she took her seat beside Melissa, her gaze fixed on the jury as they filed back into the room. Riley took his place at the defense table, his face drawn and pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. Judge Taylor addressed the jury, her expression solemn. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a serious expression, stood and unfolded a piece of paper. Yes, Your Honor, we have. Alicia held her breath, reaching for Melissa's hand under the table. Her heart pounded in her chest, drowning out the sounds of the courtroom, as if the world had narrowed down to this single moment. The foreperson read the verdict in a clear, steady voice. We, the jury, find the defendant, the Riverton Police Department, liable for damages due to unlawful detainment and emotional distress. Alicia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and disbelief. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she clutched Melissa's hand tightly, hardly daring to believe that they had won. She turned to look at the gallery behind her, seeing the faces of her supporters break into smiles, hearing the murmured words of congratulations and approval. The foreperson continued. We award damages to the plaintiff, Alicia Brooks, in the amount of $200,000. It was a symbolic victory as much as a financial one, but Alicia felt a rush of vindication flood through her. It wasn't just about the money. It was about being seen, about the court recognizing that what had happened to Lily was wrong. She glanced back at Riley, who sat motionless, staring at the table in front of him as the verdict echoed in his ears. Judge Taylor rapped her gavel to call for order. Thank you, members of the jury, for your service. This court is adjourned. Alicia turned to Melissa, pulling her into a tight hug. Thank you so much, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. You earned this, Alicia, Melissa replied, her own voice thick with emotion. You fought for it. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered to hear the verdict, their cheers echoing through the chilly afternoon air when the news broke. Reporters jostled for position, shoving microphones toward Alicia as she stepped out into the sunlight. For a moment, the noise was overwhelming, a blur of questions and camera flashes, but then she felt a small hand slip into hers. Lily stood beside her, looking up at the crowd with wide eyes. Alicia knelt down, pulling her daughter close, and whispered in her ear, It's over, sweetie. We won. Lily blinked at her mother, a small smile breaking through the uncertainty on her face. Does that mean they can't hurt us anymore? Alicia swallowed hard, holding back the tears that threatened to spill over. It means that we're stronger than we thought we were, and it means that you don't have to be afraid. She straightened up, turning back to the cameras. Daniel King joined them, a proud smile on his face as he addressed the crowd. This verdict is a victory for all of us, for every person who has felt like their voice didn't matter. It's proof that we can make change, even when it seems impossible. The reporters pressed in, asking Alicia how she felt, what her plans were now. But all Alicia could think about was getting Lily home, away from the glare of the cameras and the weight of the spotlight. She thanked everyone, her voice barely holding steady, then turned to leave with her daughter, feeling a sense of closure that had eluded her for so long. Inside the courthouse, Riley remained seated as the room emptied around him. He heard the sounds of celebration drifting in through the open windows, the cheers of people who had every reason to hate him. He couldn't bring himself to face them, to see the looks of vindication in their eyes. Eventually, Captain Collins approached, his face tight with disappointment. "Adams, I think it's time you headed out. There's not much left for you here." Riley nodded, standing slowly, feeling like his legs might give out beneath him. "I understand, sir," he murmured, his voice hollow. He left the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the cameras and the crowd. As he walked through the empty parking lot, he felt the weight of his badge in his pocket, knowing that his time on the force was over. He glanced back at the courthouse one last time, a part of him wondering if he might ever find a way to atone for what he had done. But as he turned away, he realized that redemption, if it was possible, wouldn't come from a courtroom. It would have to come from within. Riverton felt different after the verdict. The town was still the same on the surface. Its red brick buildings lining Main Street, the diner where Alicia worked, the park where Lily liked to play. But the atmosphere had shifted. People talked in hushed tones in cafes and on porches, reflecting on what the trial had meant for their community. It felt like a mirror had been held up to the town, revealing divisions that many had preferred to ignore. Alicia found herself navigating this new reality cautiously. She appreciated the support from neighbors who had stood by her, but she couldn't ignore the tension that still lingered. There were some who resented the attention the trial had brought, who blamed her for dragging Riverton into the spotlight. She tried to let their whispers roll off her, but on difficult days they clung to her like shadows. At home, Alicia focused on helping Lily adjust to their new sense of normalcy. The settlement money had eased some of their financial burdens, allowing them to move to a small house on the edge of town, away from the constant reminders of the trial. It wasn't luxurious, but it was theirs, and Alicia was determined to make it a place where Lily could feel safe again. One evening, as they sat on their new front porch watching the sun set over the distant hills, Lily turned to her mother, her expression thoughtful. "Mommy, do you think he's sorry?" Alicia knew who Lily meant. She had tried to shield her daughter from too much of the trial, but she couldn't keep everything hidden. Lily had seen the news, had heard Riley's apology during his testimony. It was a question Alicia had wrestled with herself, whether she believed that Riley's remorse was genuine, or if it was simply a reaction to the consequences he faced. "I think he might be," Alicia said carefully, stroking her daughter's hair. "But being sorry doesn't change what happened, sweetie, and it doesn't mean we have to forgive him right away." Lily nodded, resting her head against her mother's shoulder. "I don't know if I want to forgive him, but maybe I don't have to be afraid of him anymore." Alicia's heart ached at her daughter's words, but she smiled, pressing a kiss to Lily's forehead. "That's right, baby. You don't have to be afraid anymore. We're safe now." As they watched the sun dip below the horizon, Alicia felt a fragile sense of peace settle in her chest. She knew that healing would take time, that the scars of what had happened would never completely fade. But for the first time, she felt like they were moving forward, toward a future where Lily could smile again without fear. Riley's life after the trial was defined by absence. Absence of purpose, of structure, of the community that had once defined him. He had resigned from the Riverton Police Department a week after the verdict, understanding that there was no place for him there anymore. He had cleared out his desk, packed away the plaques and commendations that now felt like relics from another life, and turned in his badge for good. With no job to occupy his days, Riley spent his time in the quiet solitude of his apartment, trying to reckon with what he had become. He had always thought of himself as someone who protected others, someone who made the right choices, even when they were difficult. But now he had to face the reality that he had caused harm, that his need for control had blinded him to the humanity of the people he was supposed to serve. One morning, Riley found himself standing outside the Riverton Community Center, where Alicia and Daniel King had organized a meeting to discuss ongoing efforts for police reform. He had heard about the meeting from Officer Emma Willis, who had reached out to him after the trial, urging him to come. At first, he had resisted, afraid of how the community would react to seeing him there. But now, as he stood on the edge of the parking lot, he realized that he needed to face them, even if it meant confronting his own guilt head-on. Inside the community center, the room was filled with familiar faces, people he had once considered friends, who now looked at him with wariness and distrust. Alicia was there too, sitting in front of Daniel and a few other community leaders. Riley could feel her eyes on him as he slipped into a chair at the back of the room, and he resisted the urge to look away. Daniel took the microphone first, his voice strong as he spoke about the changes they were working toward. This town has a lot of healing to do, but we've already made progress. The settlement wasn't just about money. It was about acknowledging that something went wrong, that we need to do better, and we're not going to stop until we see real change in this town. When Daniel finished, Alicia stood to speak, her voice quieter but filled with determination. What happened to my daughter shouldn't have happened to anyone, but I believe that we can change things. I believe that we can create a place where kids can feel safe, where they don't have to be afraid of the people who are supposed to protect them. Riley listened, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He thought about leaving, slipping out before anyone could notice him, but then he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Emma standing beside him, her expression a mixture of encouragement and challenge. "You came this far, Riley," she said quietly. "Don't turn back now." Riley nodded, taking a deep breath as he rose from his seat. He walked to the front of the room, feeling the eyes of the community on him, the tension in the air thickening as he stepped up to the microphone. He could see disbelief in some faces, the anger in others, but he forced himself to meet their gazes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that what I did hurt a lot of people, and that I let my own fears get in the way of doing the right thing. But I'm here because I want to do better. I want to be part of the change that you're fighting for, if you'll let me." He paused, his throat tightening as he looked at Alicia. Her face was unreadable, her eyes guarded, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking. But he pressed on, knowing that he had to finish what he had started. "I'm not asking for a second chance," he continued. "I'm just asking for the chance to try and make things right in whatever way I can." For a long moment, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then Daniel spoke, his tone measured but not unkind. "If you're serious about that, Riley, there are ways you can help, but it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight." Riley nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "I understand. I'm ready to do the work." Alicia watched him for a long moment, then gave a small nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. "We'll see," she said softly, and it was the closest thing to a chance that Riley could hope for. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful process of rebuilding. The town of Riverton began to adjust to the changes brought about by the trial. The police department announced new training programs focused on de-escalation and community relations, and Officer Emma Willis became one of the leaders of the initiative, pushing for more transparency and accountability. Alicia found herself at the forefront of the reform efforts, working with Daniel to ensure that the changes they had fought for became a reality. She attended council meetings, spoke with other families who had faced similar struggles, and advocated for policies that would make Riverton a safer place for children like Lily. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, resistance from some members of the town, but Alicia had learned how to stand her ground. One evening after a particularly long meeting, she returned home to find Lily sitting at the kitchen table, drawing a picture with crayons. She had drawn a house with a bright blue roof, a garden filled with flowers, and two figures holding hands under the sun. "Look, Mommy," Lily said, holding up the drawing with a proud smile. "It's us in our new home." Alicia felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the picture. "It's beautiful, sweetie. You did such a good job." Lily beamed, then hesitated. Her expression is growing more serious. "Do you think we can invite some people over? Like Daniel, and maybe even Officer Emma?" Alicia paused, then smiled softly. "I think that sounds like a great idea, Lily. We'll invite them over, and we'll start making some new memories together." Riley, meanwhile, spent his days volunteering at the community center, helping with after-school programs and working alongside Emma on the new training initiatives. It wasn't the same as the life he had known before, but it was a way to give back, to try and prove that he was more than his worst mistake. He found a strange sense of purpose in the work, in the conversations he had with the kids who came through the center's doors. One afternoon, as he was packing up supplies after a workshop, he turned to find Alicia standing in the doorway. She crossed her arms, watching him with an expression that was still wary, but not as cold as it had once been. "Hi, Alicia," Riley said, his voice uncertain. Alicia nodded, glancing around the room. "I hear you've been helping out a lot here. That's good to see." Riley shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "I'm just trying to do what I can. I know it doesn't make up for what happened, but it's something." Alicia considered him for a moment, then sighed, a softness creeping into her expression. "You know, Riley, I don't think I'll ever fully forgive you for what you did to Lily, but I can see that you're trying to change, and that means something." Riley nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you. I don't expect anything more than that." Alicia held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned to leave. But before she stepped out the door, she glanced back at him, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Keep doing the work, Riley. Maybe one day we'll both find a way to move past this." As the sun set over Riverton, the town seemed to exhale, the long shadow of the trial finally beginning to lift. It would take time, months, maybe years, for the scars to heal completely, for the changes to take root. But there was hope, a sense that the town had turned a corner, that they were no longer trapped in the past. Alicia and Lily sat together on their front porch, watching the stars come out one by one. Riley walked the quiet streets near the community center, feeling the night air on his face, thinking about work still ahead of him. And somewhere in between, Riverton began to dream of a better future. Built on the hard-earned lessons of the past months later, the community center held a block party to celebrate the start of summer, and Alicia and Lily attended with a sense of cautious optimism. It was the first time they had joined such a large gathering since the trial, and Alicia was still adjusting to being in the spotlight. But as she watched Lily run through the sprinklers with other kids, her laughter ringing through the air, she felt warmth filling her chest. Daniel King came up beside her, offering her a cup of lemonade. "You've done good, Alicia. This town's starting to change, thanks to you." Alicia shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people made this happen. I just did what I had to do for Lily." Daniel nodded, raising his cup on toast. "To Lily, then, and to a better Riverton." Alicia clinked her cup against his, glancing around the park where neighbors mingled, where Emma helped set up games for the kids and where Riley stood off to the side, watching with a quiet smile. She knew that the past would never fully disappear, but she also knew that they were building something new, one small step at a time. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey through Riverton's story of accountability, change, and hope. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story that challenges and inspires. We have more stories that explore real struggles, real emotions, and the ways people can come together to make a difference. Stay tuned and be part of our growing community. And tell us in the comments, what does justice mean to you? We'd love to hear your thoughts and start a conversation.